Hey, we're back with the Hardy Boys, The Secret of the Meal, and we're on chapter 13, so we're already over halfway finished. Chapter 13, Suspicion. The roar of the explosion and the sight of the smoke and flames stunned the three boys for a moment. Chet stepped on the brake so fast that his passengers hit the dashboard. Take it easy, urged Frank, although he was excited as Chet. All thoughts of chasing the mysterious green truck were erased from the Hardys' minds. Let's get as close as possible, Frank said tersely, as Chet headed the car back towards the plant. I'd like to know what. Frank broke off as a series of explosions occurred. The brothers sat forward tensely. As the Queen drew near the main entrance, the boys could see that the flames and smoke were pouring from a single building at the northeast corner. It's one of the labs, I think, said Frank. Quickly, Chet pulled over and parked, and the boys hopped out of the jalopy. The series of explosive sounds had died away, but the damage appeared to be extensive. Most of the windows in the steel and concrete building had been blown out by the force of the blast. Smoke and flames were pouring out of the blackened spaces where the windows had been. As the boys ran towards the front, the roof of the west wing caved in. The rush of oxygen provided fuel for the new surge of flames that reached towards the sky. Luckily, this happened after closing time, Chet murmured, staring wide-eyed at the fire. There might have been a lot more injuries. I hope no one was inside, Joe exchanged worried glances with his brother. Both shared the same concern. It was for their father. I wish we could find out whether or not Dad's at Electon, Frank whispered to Joe. At this point, the boys heard the scream of sirens. Soon, fire trucks and police cars from Bayport pulled up at the front gate. The Hardys saw Chief Colleague in the first police car. They rushed up to him and asked how they happened to be there. He wrote, yeah. Sleuthing, Frank answered simply. Without going into detail, he added, Joe and I aren't sure, but we have a hunch. Dad may have been, or still is, here at Electon. All right if we go into the grounds and look around? He asked eagerly. And take Chet. The officer agreed. By this time, the guard had opened the wide gate and the fire apparatus rushed in. Some of the police officers followed while others took positions along the road to direct traffic so it would not block the path of the emergency vehicles. As the boys rode inside with the chief, Joe asked him, Any idea what caused the explosion? Not yet. Hard to tell until the firemen can get inside the building. When they reached the burning structure, Chief Colleague began directing police operations and checking with the firemen. As soon as they seemed to have the flames under control, the firemen entered the laboratory building to look for any possible victims of the explosion. The Hardys and Chet, meanwhile, had searched the outdoor area for Mr. Hardy, but did not see the detective. Maybe we were wrong about Dad's coming here, Joe said to his brother, more hopeful than before. Dad probably wouldn't have been in the lab. The brothers went back to Chief Colleague, who told them he had not seen Fenton Hardy. Just then the fire chief came up to the group. I'll bet this fire was no accident, he reported grimly to Colleague. The same thing happened in Indiana about 2 months ago, and that was sabotage. Frank and Joe stared at each other. Sabotage? Joe whispered. A startling thought flashed into Frank's mind, and drawing his brother aside, he exclaimed, Remember we overheard Dad saying on the phone the same 8-in-1 pattern? I'll be there? And 2 months equals about 8 weeks, Joe added excitedly. That might have been the saboteur's time schedule Dad was referring to. So maybe the explosion at Electon was set for today. Frank's apprehension about his father returned full force. Joe, he said tensely, Dad might have been inside the lab building trying to stop the saboteurs. Deeply disturbed, the Hardys pleaded with Chief Colleague for permission to enter the building and search for their father. I can tell you're worried, boys, the officer said sympathetically, but it's still too risky for me to let you go inside. It'll be some time before we're sure there's no danger of further explosions. I know, Frank agreed. But what if Dad is in there and badly hurt? The chief did his best to reassure the brothers. Your father would never forgive me if I let you risk your lives, he added. I suggest that you go on home and cheer up your mother in case she has the same fears you do. I promise if I see your dad, I will call you or ask him to. The boys realized that their old friend was right and slowly walked away. Frank and Joe looked back once at the blackened building outlined against the twilight sky. Wisps of smoke still curled from the torn out windows. It was a gloomy, silent trio that drove to the Hardy home in the Queen. Frank and Joe decided not to tell their mother or their aunt of their fears or give any hint of their suspicions. When the boys entered the living room, both women gave sighs of relief. They had heard the explosion and the subsequent news flashes about it. Aunt Gertrude looked at the boys sharply. By the way, where have you three been all this time? I was afraid that you might have been near Electon's. Frank, Joe, and Chet admitted that they had been. You know we couldn't miss a chance to find out what the excitement was about, Joe said teasingly, then added with assurance he was far from feeling. Don't worry, the fire was pretty much under control when we left. To change the subject, Frank said cheerfully, I sure am hungry. Let's dig into those sandwiches you brought, Chet. Good idea, Joe agreed. Are you sure you don't want me to fix you something hot to eat? Mrs. Hardy asked. Thanks, Mother, but we'll have enough, Frank smiled. Chet called his family to let them know where he was. Then the three boys sat down in the kitchen and half-heartedly munched the sandwiches. Aunt Gertrude bustled in and served them generous portions of deep dish apple pie. This is more supper than usual, Chet declared, trying hard to be cheerful. The boys finished their pie without appetite. When they refused second helpings, however, Aunt Gertrude demanded suspiciously, Are you ill or what? Oh, no, Auntie, Joe replied hastily. Just, too much detecting. I can believe that, Miss Hardy said tartly. The evening dragged on, tension mounting every minute. The boys tried to read or talk, but their concern for the detective's safety made it impossible to concentrate on anything. 11 o'clock. Where was their father? Frank and Joe wondered. Aren't you boys going to bed soon? Mrs. Hardy asked, as she and Aunt Gertrude started upstairs. Pretty soon, Frank answered. The three boys sat glumly in the living room for a few minutes until the women were out of earshot. Fellas, said Chet, I caught on that you're sure that your dad is working on an important case for Electon, and it's a top secret one. That's why you couldn't say anything about it. You're right, Frank told him. Chet went on to mention that his father had heard of various problems at Electon, production stoppage caused by power breaks, and before the buildings were complete, there were reports of tools and equipment being missing. This ties in with our hunch about the secrecy of Dad's case, Frank said. The company must have suspected that major sabotage was being planned and retained Dad to try to stop it. Talking over their speculation helped to relieve some of the tensions the boys felt and made time pass a little faster as they waited for news of Fenton Hardy. I wonder how the saboteurs got into the plant, Joe said, thinking out loud. Both the gates are locked and well guarded. It seems almost impossible for anyone to have sneaked in the necessary amount of explosives without inside help. A sudden thought flashed into Frank's mind. He leaped to his feet. The green truck! He exclaimed. It was unmarked, remember? It could have been carrying dynamite, camouflaged under ordinary supplies. That could be, Frank. Joe jumped in. If so, no wonder it was in such a rush. I'll phone the chief right now and give him the truck's license number. Frank went with Joe to the hall telephone. As they approached the phone, it rang. The bell shattering the tense atmosphere seemed louder than usual. "It must be Dad!" exclaimed the brothers together, and Chet hurried into the hall. Frank eagerly lifted the receiver. "Hello," he said expectantly. The next moment Frank looked dejected. He replaced the receiver and said glumly, "Wrong number." The Hardys exchanged bleak looks. What had happened to their father? And that's the end of chapter 13. You'll have to join me again to find out what's happening or what's going to happen in chapter 14.